From the outside it looks like a normal story of staying home, but inside it is full of mystery and tension. In this video, I will tell you 3 stories of staying home alone. Prepare your coffee, let's start. I was still living with my parents when this incident occurred, which was a few years ago. I had lived there for the past few years, and before I departed for college, my parents purchased a new home and moved us into it. It was farther away from both the city and most of the suburbs. It appeared really isolated in the woods, and I thought it was kind of a mansion. Even though there were only the 3 of us, we had relatives who frequently visited us while we were there. That, in my opinion, was their justification for purchasing a larger home than we actually needed. In any case, this week marked the rare occasion when my folks actually took a plane to visit the rest of our family. They invited me to accompany them, but I stayed behind to keep an eye on the home since I didn't want to miss a week of school and have to catch up on work and everything else. I quickly realized that I didn't like living alone in this new place. The house was simply so large and had several long corridors with empty spare rooms, making it uncomfortable. To make matters worse, the house was built over a century ago, which was already a disturbing fact. I was old enough to ignore that discomfort to a certain degree, but it still lingered. Everything went smoothly the first 2 days my parents were gone. I went to school, spent time with some friends, and just relaxed at home. I went to school as usual on the 3rd day, went out to eat with my friends, and didn't get home until around 6 or 7 o'clock that evening. I was feeling a little worn out and wanted to spend the rest of the night in bed because it was already getting rather dark outside. After leaving my school supplies beside the door, I entered the house and walked to the 2nd floor. I was almost at my room when, looking down the long main upstairs corridor, I noticed something odd. One of the extra bedrooms had an open door. I didn't immediately think anything was wrong, but it reminded me of the uneasiness I often experienced. I walked back to look at the empty room. It was totally empty except for a bed and a few shabby pieces of furniture. Even when I closed the door, I still felt weird about it. My room was at the end of that hallway, which is why it bothered me. I don't know how I could have missed seeing that door open until today, given I pass by all of these doors multiple times every day. I always hated it when the doors of this huge estate were left open because it felt odd to walk by so many empty rooms. I took a brief look around the home before unwinding, not going into every room, but just scanning for anything that looked out of place. I figured maybe I just hadn't noticed the open door earlier, and I tried not to get too spooked. While I was away from home, maybe the door opened up on its own, as if it hadn't been properly shut. I went to my room and turned on the television in an effort to relax. Unfortunately, it didn't do much good. Throughout this huge house, I kept thinking about how alone I was and how I had no way of knowing what was going on in any of the other rooms. What was disturbing was the ambiguity, not the fact that anything was happening. About 45 minutes to an hour passed before I started to feel hungry for dinner. I took the passage from my room to the 1st floor. Another oddity of living in a house like this was that almost never were all the lights on. As a result, I was constantly walking through dark areas and gloomy corners. While I was in the kitchen, I kept getting the feeling that I was seeing something in the far-off living room. Every time I raised my head, the room was black and empty. I thought I was going crazy. I was just overanalyzing everything in my head. And the last thing I wanted to do was give in to these unwarranted anxious feelings. I decided to ignore it, telling myself I was just being spooked. After preparing dinner, I made my way back to my room. However, I immediately felt cold when I reached that corridor. Once again, that door was open. For perhaps a full minute, I just froze, gazing down the dim hallway. I was unable to comprehend how this was happening. I was honestly wondering at that point if the property was haunted. Before living in a spooky, 100-year-old home in the middle of the woods, I didn't think that sort of thing even existed. I crept back up to the spare room, opened the door slightly, and peered inside. It looked the same as it did before. I went inside and looked for any small clues, like a dirty shoe print or something that had been moved, but I couldn't find anything. I went back to my room, feeling even more uneasy, and shut and locked the door. Trying not to come across as overly worried, I called my parents to ask whether they had ever noticed that spare room door being open or if there had ever been any issue with it. They replied right away, saying they hadn't seen anything and weren't entirely sure what I was talking about. I told them not to worry and that it was probably nothing, but I have to admit, I was growing more uneasy by the second. I had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I believe I had been eating and watching TV in my room for 10 or so minutes when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming down the hallway. I heard a bang just outside my bedroom door as I rushed for the remote and paused the TV. My heart was pounding. I was too terrified to move during the long silence, during which there were no other sounds in the house. Then, as if they were only tapping on the door, whoever was outside gently and slowly knocked on the other side. I couldn't believe this was happening. It was so bizarre that I didn't know how to respond. Before they knocked or tapped on the door again, it felt like a full minute had passed. I finally yelled, "Who's there? I've already called the cops." That was a lie, of course, but I wanted whoever it was to go away. I knew I would eventually have to call the police, but since it would take them at least 10 to 15 minutes to arrive, it didn't feel helpful in that moment. I was forced to wait it out by myself. There were just 3 more knocks on my door, all coming slowly and calmly like before. In the end, I decided to call the police. If they were just going to stand out there and wait, I thought that was the best thing to do. I gave my address and information to the operator. They asked what the person was doing at the moment. I was going to explain that they were just standing outside my door when I heard a loud scratching sound against the wood. With one long scrape, it sounded like they were dragging something against the door. I started to panic and begged the operator to send help immediately. Fortunately, I had locked the door before the handle started to jiggle. Another minute or 2 passed, followed by 3 more knocks. Then silence. I waited quietly for 5 more minutes until the police arrived. No one was outside my bedroom when they got there. The only sign that anyone had been there was a long gash on the back of my door, clearly caused by a knife. It was nearly impossible for the police to determine how someone may have entered the house because there were so many windows and entrances. Also, most of the windows had antique, broken locking mechanisms. Ultimately, nothing significant was found. My parents flew home as quickly as they could. Even though nothing else happened after that, I never felt at ease in that house again. Every empty room and gloomy hallway felt even more eerie because of the trees surrounding the property. A week after the event, I thought I saw someone standing in the trees near the window. But it was dark, so it may have just been a shadow. Luckily, I no longer live in that house. My parents sold it a few months later. We'll never know who was following us there, or what was going on with that house. Friday night was very normal for me. I lived alone in a little suburban house an hour from my place of employment, all across the city. I was excited to do nothing except watch YouTube, play games, and maybe go to bed when the weekend finally arrived. I had a brief shower when I got home, then switched on the PlayStation and played games and relaxed for a few hours. I even cracked open a few beers. The evening was going really well, and I figured the only thing that could make it perfect would be to order some pizza. After ordering from a local pizza business using their app, I unwound on the sofa and watched YouTube on TV while I waited. But after 45 minutes, I noticed that I hadn't received any SMS confirming their arrival, and that it had been quite some time since I placed the order. I took my phone out to check the app. There was a delay, it stated. The message was pretty general and essentially said, "I'm sorry you had to wait. But I can't recall the precise words. The delivery of your order is imminent." It made no difference. I was trying to stay up late even though I could feel my eyelids becoming heavier. Maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. Over the next 15 minutes, YouTube played in the background while I slowly drifted off to sleep. The doorbell rang, and I woke up suddenly. "Oh, the pizza delivery," I thought as I sprang from the couch. I had no idea how long I had been unconscious or how long the delivery man had been waiting for me. I hurried over and opened the door. I was still feeling somewhat drowsy, and the few beers I had earlier didn't help at all. A guy was standing on my porch. "I apologize, I hope you didn't have to wait long. What is the amount I owe you?" "Weary," I replied. The man looked quite perplexed. I explained, "How much do I owe you for the pizzas?" As I was speaking, I became aware that this man was not even carrying any pizza boxes. Or anything else, for that matter. Not even a uniform. He was dressed in black slacks and a gray sweater draped over his head, and his hands were stuffed in his pockets. For a long moment, the man waited awkwardly, as though he was still processing what I had said. But then he smiled and said, "Don't worry. The pizzas were still not here." Then he just stopped talking and stared at me as if that were a normal reaction. Even though I was exhausted and a little inebriated, I felt that was an odd reaction. If the pizza was still on the way, why was he here? However, I just responded, "Okay." I shut the door after a few more awkward seconds of silence. I attempted to gather my thoughts by massaging my face. Why was the exchange so peculiar? I knew I wasn't in the correct frame of mind, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned on a fresh DVD, took a seat, and continued watching until I dozed off once again. This time, I woke up to a clicking noise. I didn't know what it was. But I knew I had only been sleeping for a few minutes since the movie was still playing. I sat up again and waited for anything to happen, like a doorbell or a knock, but nothing did. I had never heard that clicking sound before, but just then. I finally decided to see if there were any order updates in the app. I unlocked my phone, but before I could even go beyond the lock screen, I was confused. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I had placed my order at 11 o'clock, and the pizza business didn't even open until 1 a.m. After an hour of delay, I checked the app again. And saw that the seller had canceled the order. But then, who had just knocked on my door? I got up from the couch and walked down the hall to the front door. There was no one there when I peered through the peephole. When I reached down to unlock and open the door, I realized it was already unlocked. When I answered the door a little while ago, I must have been so preoccupied that I forgot to lock it. I opened the door and looked out. I saw nothing except a quiet, empty neighborhood. I was far too drunk and exhausted to handle whatever was going on. I shut the door without receiving any response, and immediately froze. It was exactly that sound, the door clicking into the doorway, that had woken me earlier. My face turned pale. I quickly relived our entire exchange in my head, realizing my mistake, and the fact that he was only pretending to be the pizza delivery man after I brought it up. Why would he lie about that? What was his motive? I turned to face the still, dark house. I had no choice, I had to leave. I slipped back down the hall and tried to grab my phone from the couch. Just before I could reach it, I heard movement in the adjacent room. I grabbed my phone in a hurry and ran to the front door. I called 911 as I dashed from the house and sprinted to the far end of the block. Even though the police showed up just a few minutes after I called, it wasn't quick enough. The man was gone. I gave them all the information I could think of, everything about him. Both his words and his appearance. But so far, that's all we have. And unless something else happens, it's likely to stay that way. I can't stop thinking about that night, trying to figure out what really happened. But I'm not certain. The order's cancellation may have been a very unfortunate coincidence. But the main question is, why was this stranger outside my house, ringing the doorbell at 4 a.m. in the first place? What did he mean by his strange behavior? He was probably looking for vacant homes, or easy targets to rob, or worse. He probably could tell I was inebriated, exhausted, and not in the right frame of mind as I walked through the door. He must have thought he could take advantage of that. He might have even waited outside, listening, to see whether I had locked the door. He simply waited for me to fall asleep again. Just for a few minutes. That night may have gone very differently. And probably would not have ended well for me, if I hadn't woken up when I did. In mid-2019, I moved to a new place because of a work opportunity. I had very little when I relocated and got the job. So, I rented the smallest room in the cheapest apartment I could find. It was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a small complex, which had only 4 apartments. They were really old and outdated, and the location wasn't particularly nice. For the first 3 months, I lived alone in the complex. since the apartment was only meant to be temporary, just until I had enough money saved from my new job. I tried to ignore my slight uneasiness, even though all 3 of the other flats were vacant. The job, however, turned out to be far more hectic than I had expected. Late nights, a lot of overtime, and a generally toxic work environment left me drained. I barely spent any time at home aside from sleeping. One evening, around 8 p.m., I came home exhausted and barely conscious. As I entered my apartment and walked down the hallway to my room, I heard a tap at the door. The knock startled me. It was abrupt and sharp. When I checked the peephole, I could barely see anything. The glass seemed dirty, cracked, or discolored. Without knowing who it was, I opened the door. Standing just outside was an older man, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, with black hair and a beard. His eyes were striking in a very unsettling way. "How can I help you?" I asked. He stared at me for a moment, then his eyes widened slightly as he asked, "Do you live here?" I thought that was a strange question, but I replied, "Yeah." He smiled and said he just wanted to introduce himself, as he was moving into the apartment next to mine. He then walked down to the neighboring unit, entered it, and waved goodbye awkwardly. Oddly, he never told me his name or offered a proper introduction. I thought he was a strange old man, but that was all. Honestly, it was a bit comforting to know someone else had finally moved into the otherwise empty building where I had been living alone. The next day was long, and I went to bed early that night. When I got home again around the same time, I climbed the stairs to my apartment. That's when I noticed something strange. The blinds in the window of the neighboring apartment shifted, just slightly, but enough that it seemed like someone had been watching me. The swaying of the curtains gave me the impression that he had been peeking through. I rushed to my door and went inside, brushing off the feeling. I told myself not to overthink it. Still, about 30 seconds later, there was another knock at the door. I went to the peephole, again forgetting that I couldn't see anything through it, and opened the door. There he was again, looking exactly the same as the night before. "Is there something you need?" "I'm kind of in a rush," I said, trying not to sound rude. I had just finished another long day and wasn't in the mood to talk. He didn't seem to acknowledge my tone. Instead, he asked with a little chuckle, "Do you know how to use the thermostat in these units?" I must be too old to figure it out. I briefly explained how it worked, just a few buttons, nothing complicated. He nodded, smiled again, and said he thought he had already tried what I described, then asked if I could come over and show him. I told him I was really in a hurry. He apologized but then started getting a little passive-aggressive, almost demanding, insisting he really needed my help and that it would only take 30 seconds. It was cold outside, and it was the middle of winter. I started to feel guilty. What if he truly couldn't get the heat working? Eventually, I gave in and said, "Okay." I just wanted him to stop bothering me. He led me to his apartment via the shared balcony. The door was already open. He walked inside, but the moment I reached the doorway, I froze. The apartment was empty. No furniture. No boxes. No signs of anyone moving in. The walls were filthy, paint was peeling, and the entire place looked abandoned. Just looking at it, I could tell that no one had lived there for a very long time. What struck me most was the stench, something rotten and foul wafting through the open door. He noticed my hesitation and looked back at me. "It's right here, come on." I tried to think of an excuse not to go in, but my mind went blank. He gestured again, but this time his expression had changed. What had seemed friendly now looked hollow. Melancholy. Desperate, in the most unsettling way. Then he stepped toward me, too fast. I panicked and ran back to my apartment. I slammed the door and locked it behind me. A few seconds later, I heard the handle rattle. He was trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and started calling the police. While I was on the phone, he yelled through the door in a calm voice, "What's wrong?" "I just needed your help." He knocked a few more times, then walked away. I listened carefully. No movement. No footsteps. Nothing until the police arrived. By then, he was gone. The officers confirmed what I had feared. The apartment was still vacant. He had broken in and had likely been squatting there for several days, possibly watching me, learning my schedule, waiting for the right moment. I'm absolutely convinced that something far worse could have happened if I had gone into that apartment, or if I had continued letting him interact with me. I moved out the very next day. Do you have any interest in lighthouses? If so, your curiosity will increase after this video.